Okay, finally, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be back in this room at La Maison Française and to welcome Lee Edelman in person. After a year and a half of remote conferences, we are finally getting back in touch with real humans. And yes, I can assure you, Lee is here physically. He's not a hologram. We can almost touch him. However, we are not yet back to normal because only people affiliated to NYU are allowed to be in this room. So we have to set up a hybrid system, thanks to Courtney Rutherford, that a system that allows us to address you on Zoom, still on Zoom, I'm sorry, and we are waiting to welcome you back soon. And of course, at the end of the lecture, the audience will ask questions, but you could also ask your question through the Q&A on your screen, on the Zoom screen. So tonight, we have the honor of listening to a lecture by one of the great thinkers of queer theory and psychoanalysis. Lee Edelman is the Fletcher Professor of English Literature at Tufts University, and he's working on sexuality, cultural politics, and film, Hitchcock, Almodovar, and so on. He has written numerous essays, including Homo Graphicis Essays in Gay Literary and Cultural Theory in 1994, No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive in 2004, and this book has been translated in French by this wonderful title, Merde au futur. And also he published Sex and the Unbearable with Lauren Berlens in 2013. And in French, Lee has published L'impossible homosexuel, 8 essais de théorie queer. So tonight, Lee has proposed to talk about Lacan and the question of race. Lee, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. It's good of you to come out. It is I, though you would not know what the mask. And I suppose I could have gotten someone more eloquent to take my place, and you never would have known, and I would have gotten a better reputation. But you're stuck with me, so this is how it is. The essay I'm going to read today has 2 epigraphs. The first one is going to require a little bit of explanation. The second one will not. So I'll start with the first epigraph, which is from Lacan, and explain it a little bit, and then I will end with the second epigraph. So the first one is from L'étourdi, and in it Lacan says, Freud puts us on the path of that which absence designates as sex. It's through the swelling up, à la gonfle, of this sens of sex that a topology spreads out where the word is determining. So that's the epigraph. At the heart of psychoanalysis, then, Lacan situates the entanglement of sex as it is designated by what he calls absence, with the words whose meanings, sens, yield worlds through what he refers to as sens ab sex. What sense can we make of this sens ab sex? How does this echo of absence in ab sex affect its signification? And why is the topology it unfolds associated with inspiration or engorging, gonfler? By connecting sens with the portmanteau term absex, sens absex reasserts the sens that the ab of absence had subtracted. It does so, however, by putting sex in the place of subtraction instead. Sex, that is, as complicit with and designated by absence, sex as the pure negativity that enables meaning but has none. With that act of designation, where to designate, désigne, already bears signe, the signifier of signification within it, absence posits sex as subtracted from the register of meaning at the very moment of its insertion into the signifying chain by virtue of designating it. Sex, understood as the positive difference between male and female beings, thus positivizes the negativity of absence through the binarism of complementary identities. So constructed, sex nurtures fantasies of wholeness, union, and repair, but it possesses no positivity for Lacan. No meaning and no existence from which sense has been withdrawn. The absenting of sense is originary, prior to sense as such. Sex as designated by absence quite simply is this primal subtraction. Sex is just the subtraction from nothingness. This inherent exclusion from being or meaning that libidinizes the mastery implicit in comprehending an order of things. Absence as extraction, excision, or cut makes possible the designation of sex by condensing the division or negativity that sex is with the division that is articulation. Such designation, however, dooms sex as absence to the realm of the unthinkable at the very moment of making what we think of as sex accessible to thought. The excluded negativity of absence swells through this designation of sex into the signifying topology of sens ab sex, without sex. The order of meaning generated through the subtraction of absence from the sex that it designates. Once designated, that is, sex hardens into a positive identity and vanishes as absence. It suffers, one might say, a subtraction from itself, once situated in the topological field where Lacan notes the word is determining. C'est le mot qui tranche. Though determining can adequately translate qui tranche, a phrase that indicates the authority to decide or determine a situation's outcome, qui tranche literally refers to something that slices, cuts, or divides. Sens ab sex may operate with reference to a swelling up or engorgement, recalling the Lacanian phallus's Aufhebung as it is raised to its position as the privileged signifier of the symbolic order of meaning. But it disseminates a topology wherein the meaningless priority of the cut alone lets an entity appear as itself. This cut, like the cut of castration, is what the phallus purports to positivize or flesh out. Indeed, the cut, one might say, is the phallus before its sublation swells out the world with meaning by cutting out or excising from it the senselessness of sex as absence. That's the first epigraph. The second epigraph, much shorter. It's from James Baldwin. As long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. As long as you think you're white, I'm going to be forced to think I'm black. The rest of this talk is going to try to set forth or shed light on some of the connections between these two epigraphs. It's a commonplace of progressive thought that racism is irrational. For Lacan, however, racism is nothing if not logical. Racism, as he put it in the quote, is constituted by the way symbolic places are transmitted by an order of discourse, unquote. Unlike those raised in the American context, where racism gets wholly imaginarized through the epidermal schema, Lacan approaches racism as inherently symbolic, thinking it in terms of the logic that generates the schema of sexuation and interpreting its stigmatization of difference through the lens of the German occupation. But if, or because, the Nazi regime shapes the way he thinks about race, he insists on the arbitrary relation between racist ideology and the biological imaginary. He denies, for example, that racism emerges from the physical anthropology to which Hegel, for example, turned. Despite what Lacan calls the grotesque attempt to found a Third Reich on that basis, he locates the roots of racism not in bios, but in logos. More precisely, in the logical positions by which a discourse locates the subject in relation to enjoyment and in relation to surplus enjoyment, and thus in relation to the phallic function that underlies his meditations on universality. However much he may stray from this insight in the course of his seminars, Lacan makes clear in L'Étourdi that he dispenses with what he calls the ethnography of primitive peoples, or the recourse to elementary structures in order to deal with the racism of discourses in action, unquote. Races, he argues, are discursive products, and the logic of discursive production invariably eventuates in racism. Racism, that is, not only makes sense, it's the corollary of sense-making. In Seminar 12, Lacan revisits Freud's reading of Nazism through group psychology and the discourse of the leader. The German people, at the very moment they were questioning capitalist discourse and its predication on surplus value, were crystallized, as Lacan observes. The word he uses is cristallisé, perhaps punning on Kristallnacht, by secretly identifying with an object that reified Hitler's plus de jouir, an object that could have been anything and that might have gone no further, Lacan puts it, than Hitler's mustache. Though it expressed itself in adherence to Hitler's idealization of race, this identification itself, he argues, fixed on the plus de jouir of the other, conceived as familiar, as tu instead of vous, as the leader, to be sure, but as one of an us that gains access through him to his plus de jouir. Later, in Télévision, Lacan explains an assertion he had made in seminars 18 and 19, that the world would soon see a resurgence of racism, asserting that such an outcome was both predictable and inevitable. Such racism, he argues, follows from the égarement, the wandering off of our jouissance, occasioned by the subject's determination by language, with the consequence, as he then observes, that, quote, only the other, the absolute other, the radically other, can situate that jouissance and situate it so as to emphasize it as being the other, which is to say that we are separated from the other side of sex, unquote. But this other, exempt from the phallic function, which limits our access to jouissance by imposing this égarement, is figured in Télévision by Lacan, though not in the published English translation, as more than the other side of sex. If there is no sexual relation, he declares, it is because the other is of another race. To the extent that woman, as Lacan put it in 1960, represents the absolute other, she can, as the other side of sex, be condensed in Télévision into the otherness that denotes another race, because race itself, for Lacan, is only, so to speak, contingently racialized. Far from returning us, in other words, to Freud's trope of female sexuality as a dark continent for psychology, Lacan's laminating of racial and sexual otherness underscores the logical framework to which sex and race belong, a logical framework imposed by the phallic function in the symbolic. That function, as you surely know, that function establishes castration as man's universal condition by means of the exception, the one whose enjoyment escapes alienation by and in the language of the symbolic. The consistency that confers legibility on the other, construed as another race, where that racialization both instantiates and reifies its otherness, sets it apart from a given order's regime of universality, insofar as it seems to forego the collective sacrifice of enjoyment. If this other seems to enact the full enjoyment of the primal father, the exception to the phallic function, unconstrained in his jouissance, then the response that this engenders is the racist reassertion precisely of universality. The reassertion, that is, of the other as equally determined by the phallic function, even if in need of a reminder. The imposition of universality procures as a profit the plus de jouir, the surplus enjoyment afforded Freud's band of brothers, who called forth universality with their prohibition of unrestrained enjoyment. Though the English translation again elides it, Lacan returns to the racialized associations of such jouissance when he notes in Télévision that the other whose enjoyment signals its appurtenance to another race could only be permitted that mode of enjoyment, quote, if we hadn't for a long time imposed our own upon it, if things had not reached the point where we can only think the other as underdeveloped, unquote. This primitivization of the other's enjoyment, though colored by the primal father's status as exception to the phallic function, enacts the racializing plus de jouir by imposing on the other what Lacan then calls the precarity of our own mode of jouissance, which is to say, the unbehagen, the unease, anxiety, or discontent Freud sees in civilization. The paradox Lacan insists on resides in the emergence of racism as coincident with the affirmation of universal equality, and so with what we think of as the democratizing impulse, whose place in the French imaginary, via the notion of fraternité, suggests a link to the band of brothers. Lacan, that is, reads racism as the corollary and consequence of brotherhood, and bound up, therefore, with a universality that is nothing more than the insistence on equal precarity of jouissance. He makes this explicit in his seminar, Ou pire, quote, in all of this, I haven't spoken to you about the father, because I considered that I had already said enough, explained enough, to show you that it's around him as the one who oneifies, as the one who says no, that all there is of universality can found itself, must found itself, and can do no other than found itself. And when we return to the root of the body, if we revalorize the word brother, it comes back at full speed to the level of benevolent feelings. But since it won't do just to paint you a rosy future, you should know that what is increasing with ultimate consequences that we have yet to see, and what roots itself in the body, that is, in the fraternity of the body, is the racism about which you haven't heard the end, unquote. This reference to racism's rootedness in the fraternity of the body, the fraternity that is of renouncing the enjoyment that is ultimately of the body for Lacan, serves as a bridge for my thinking today in conjunction with a recent book published by David Marriott called Lacan Noir. I want in particular to address a claim that is central to Marriott's remarkable, probing, and unsettling thinking in Lacan Noir, a book that I would urge all of you to read for its profoundly original and rigorously theorized reimagining of psychoanalysis. Lacanian theory, Marriott argues, in its formalizing thought, in its displacement of imaginary relations, such as those that prop up ego psychology, with the structural logic, such as those that prop up ego psychology, leaves something, as Marriott phrased it in an early version of his book, unsaid, quote, the very whiteness of his thought, unquote. Marriott expands on this point when he speaks, not wholly unironically, of what he calls good or authentic psychoanalysis, by which he means Lacan's rewriting of Freud with explicit reference to the signifier. Quote, good or authentic psychoanalysis is also irredeemably white in its most positive presupposition, i.e., why assume the signifier's servitude pertains to a universal enslavement, and why presume that the signifier is joined to slavery, unquote. Though he never specifies what whiteness signifies except by implication, Marriott associates it, cannily and largely persuasively, with access to social being through signification as such, with the logic of mastery inherent in what Lacan calls, quote, the illusion that the signifier serves the function of representing the signified, as well as in the Lacanian reversal, by which the signified remains below the bar, inaccessible to thought by anything but the signifier itself. In the signifier's subordination of the object as appearance, Marriott finds a foundational segregation in Lacanian theory, a segregation whereby the signifier simultaneously subjugates and effaces an object, a materiality, and in Marriott's view, a blackness, wholly cut off from symbolic meaning. And that cutting off, he argues, finds its echo in the implicit assertion that blackness, like the black social subject, has no meaning for Lacanian theory. Using Fanon as a corrective, he reads the black person, assigned the position of the nègre, as indexed to this displacement of the object in its status as appearance by the signifier and by signification. In other words, the signifier masters the traces of the object's disappearance, working to make it unknowable in the racialized order of signification. Blackness for Marriott thus coincides with, quote, the puzzle of an X that cannot be symbolized or reduced to the logic of the signifier, unquote. And it induces the colonized subject's psychic self-production as neutral and colorless, as distinct from the, quote, nègre, as phobically unassimilable imago, with the result, as he puts it, that, quote, blackness is neither imaginary nor symbolic, but a certain symbolic regression by which the real reappears, not as a lost thing, but as an object that is magically conjured into being, unquote. Developing this notion earlier in his text, he unpacks it in these terms, quote, the black is precipitated into being as the retroactive mark of a renunciation, a negative sign. It has no being except in the body, but it is unable to see the body to which it belongs, except as a moribund and wasting incertitude, a depository whose imaginary form is imposed. And this form is none other than an enigma, an X, unquote. Using this passage as a springboard, I want to engage it in terms of some questions raised at the outset of Lacan Noir. After noting that, quote, nowhere does Lacan ever indicate that he is speaking to Black people, Marriott asks, so did he pay no heed to blackness? If you look for blackness in his work, you will not find it. So why try and think blackness through Lacan? Should one not be indifferent to this indifference, unquote? Marriott's questions are crucial, but as his own text later goes on to suggest, blackness is not wholly absent from Lacan. In tandem, therefore, with Marriott's comments on Lacan's exploration in Seminar 19 of universality, oneness, and negation, by way of Aristotle's logical permutations of the proposition man is white, I want to suggest that a major locus of Lacan's conceptualization of blackness and on the relations among blackness, logic, and social collectivity may be hiding in plain sight. Hiding, in particular, in his account of a structure that explicitly requires the subject to identify itself as black or white. I refer, of course, to the well-known text, Logical Time and the Assertion of Anticipated Certainty, a text that some of you may recall. If not, I'll briefly explain what's at stake in it. In this essay, Lacan discusses a mind experiment, a puzzle or a game, a challenge that takes the following form. The warden of a prison presents 3 inmates with 5 small discs, 2 black and 3 white, one of which he proposes to affix to each prisoner's back, where others can see it, but the person bearing it cannot. The warden then promises freedom to the first who can tell him correctly, in the absence of any communication with his fellows, whether he is black or white, and how, using logical means alone, he arrived at that conclusion. Much has been written about this essay, including important interventions by Zizek, Badiou, Bruce Fink, Derek Cook, Adrian Johnston, and Chen-Yang Wang, to name a few. Most of it focuses on the extent to which Lacan's solution to the problem fails or succeeds in evading the sophism he locates in what his essay calls the perfect solution to the problem. But none of these writers addresses the puzzle's residue of imaginary content, the trace of what Marriott calls appearance, as other than an arbitrary stand-in for symbolic difference, as a signifier for the subject is always a signifier itself. As Marriott might say, the indifference to this difference as anything other than structural structures the readings of the essay, as indeed it can seem to structure Lacan's thought in the essay itself. But no psychoanalytic narrative called forth to explore the limits of logic could shield its framing from scrutiny by describing its narrative figure as arbitrary, especially not in an essay framed by 2 moments that inflect its logic of precipitous or anticipated conclusion in urgent relation to the social and political realities of racialized violence. The few readers who have written about the post-war context of Logical Time content themselves with noting its implicit response to the German occupation, as seen, for example, when Lacan, at the end of the essay, offers a pseudo-syllogistic alternative to classical logic's derivation of the proposition, I am a man. He describes his pseudo-syllogism as, quote, the logical form of all human assimilation, precisely insofar as it posits itself as a simulative of a barbarism, unquote. This phrase may echo Benjamin's words from On the Concept of History. There is no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. But Lacan more narrowly focuses on the violence of assimilation into a collective and the brutality born of the fear of being denied a place within that collective, the fear with which racial identity was charged in occupied France. It's worth remembering that his essay, as revised for publication in Écrit, appears beneath a headnote that anticipates its argument, a headnote alluding to the occupation and obliquely to the willingness of many French, like the institutions of the Vichy government, to assimilate to the order of the occupying power by enforcing their racial policies. The headnote recalls that in 1945, Logical Time appeared in the recommencement issue of a journal called Les Cahiers d'Art, an issue, quote, conceived with the intent of filling the space between the figures on its cover 1940 to 1944, with the illustrious names in its table of contents, unquote. The essay, that is, took part in an effort to fill in the blank space, the temporal gap in the journal's publication history, the gap of the Nazi occupation, with contributions from illustrious figures, as if, from their position in 1945, that work could fill or occupy the void of the occupation itself. As if that work could cover up the trauma of the dates on the cover itself. Dates that have the effect of making the issue of the journal predate itself. Moving from that first appearance of the essay to its placement among his écrits, Lacan gives voice to a hope. May it resound with the right note here where I am placing it, between the before and the after, even if it demonstrates that the after was already waiting in the wings so that the before could find its place, unquote. As the gap installed by the occupation seemed to produce a before and an after, and as the issue emblazoned with the occupation's dates positioned its contents between those dates, between the before and the after, so now he situates his essay amid those collected écrits. So now as he situates his essay amid those collected écrits, Lacan puts it after others that come before it chronologically, thus anticipating its conceptual focus on temporal precipitation by dramatizing the inverted relation of an after to a before. Now, without rehearsing his analysis of the prisoner's conundrum at length, I want to remind you that Lacan resolves it in relation to three distinct temporal scansions, as he calls it. These three are the instance of the glance, the time for comprehension, and the moment of concluding. Each of these stages requires the prisoners to make a logical deduction whose enabling ground is always the same. And the ground is this: whoever should see the two other prisoners as black would know at a glance that he is white and would leave. Because all the prisoners in the Lacanian version see their companions as white, each in the time of comprehension, that is to say, they can't just leave at a glance because they're not seeing their two companions as black. So there has to be a second stage. Because they see their fellow prisoners as white, each in the time for comprehension must then imagine the logic by which his fellow prisoners would respond, were he himself black. In that case, each of the others would reason that if he himself were black, as well as the one who is the prisoner imagining this being black, then the third person would at a glance have known that he was white and would have left. And thus will deduce that since the other person has not done that, he himself cannot be black and must be white. And thus he would know he was white and would be able to leave. Since that didn't happen, and since all are alleged to be equal intelligence, all then would come to the simultaneous recognition, since they are all white in this example, that they are white, and all would start to leave at once. But seeing the others leaving too, each would suddenly come to a stop, afraid that perhaps he judged too hastily, since the basis of his judgment was the absence of any movement on the part of the others. And since they are all moving, that absence of movement no longer obtains. The result for Lacan is a second hesitation on the part of the prisoners that objectifies their prior subjective conclusion. For had any prisoner seen another as black, the first hesitation by the other two would have settled his doubts. And if all of them stop a second time, it can only be because each starts to wonder, on seeing the others moving, if their movement means that they have in fact seen him as black. A doubt immediately resolved, however, by the fact that they also stop. Therefore, only by accelerating his own conclusion in response to the conclusion of the others, can any prisoner, in theory, triumph. But as Badiou and Chen-Yang Wang suggest, this game cannot be won. Either the prisoners are simply logical machines who will always solve the puzzle in the same way at exactly the same time, or they have different reasoning capacities and different judgments of the capacities of their fellows, which introduces doubt about the speed or success of the other's rational abilities, and thus subverts any strictly logical interpretation of the other's actions. In attempting to negotiate between these two options, Lacan makes clear that the pressure to reach the moment of conclusion on the part of the prisoners arises, quote, not because of some dramatic contingency, the seriousness of the stakes, or the competitiveness of the game, unquote. It is rather, he argues, from, quote, the urgency of the logical movement that the subject precipitates both its judgment and his departure, precipitates in the etymological sense of the verb, the head in advance, unquote. But if it's separated from both the stakes in the game and from any inherent competitiveness, then of what precisely does the urgency of the logical movement consist? How does the analysis of logical possibilities generate, in the words of Lacan, quote, the ontological form of anxiety, curiously reflected in the expression, quote, for fear that, unquote, the lagging behind might engender error. Insofar as we recognize the continuity of anxiety and jouissance, we can find a first answer to this question in the seminar Au Pire, where Lacan writes, quote, logic is amazingly rich in jouissance, precisely because it pertains to the field of castration. Referring to the essay on logical time in his seminar Les Noms du Père, Lacan insists that the prisoners have no natural identity, but function strictly as illustrative instances, identical in the universality that reduces them to nothing but mere supports for the discs that they bear on their backs. But those discs themselves give rise to identities, effecting a shift from logical abstraction to the fear of error or insufficiency, that is, to the ontological form of anxiety that corresponds to the possibility of their assimilation into or their exclusion from a collective. To win the game, were winning possible, one would have to abridge the time of comprehension and leap to the moment of conclusion by racing ahead of the others in a movement both coordinated with and in advance of theirs. One must act, Lacan claims, subjectively to assert what assertion alone makes objective. The act engenders its certainty, Lacan writes. But here's the thing that Lacan doesn't note. Only one group of prisoners can ever succeed in performing that act. Describing the subjective certainty that precedes its objective verification, Lacan ventriloquizes the logic the successful prisoner will have to perform. Quote, I hasten to conclude that I was a white, because otherwise they would have preceded me in reciprocally recognizing themselves to be whites. And had I given them time to do so, they would have led me astray, which would have been my undoing, unquote. Now, given the distribution of discs in the Lacanian version of the game, where all the prisoners' discs are white, it's obvious that, in order to win, one must identify oneself as white. But given the rules that govern the game, even if there were a prisoner assigned a black disc, such a prisoner could never, under any circumstance, win. The minority status allotted to blackness, where it is always -1 in terms of the number of discs available, assures the advantage to him who sees one or more of the others as black. Knowledge here is inseparable from the diacritical determination of whiteness from blackness, but that knowledge is not reciprocal. The foundational logic on which solving the puzzle depends is that seeing two blacks means that one is white, and so can leave immediately. One wins the game, and with it one's freedom, only by being white, which surely, to return to the question of the black social subject in Lacanian thought, is what any black subject knows. But the freedom so obtained, as Wang observes, may be less than meets the eye. Insofar as obtaining the correct answer, Wang writes, requires the subject to desubjectify or even dehumanize himself to the extent that he must faithfully occupy a symbolic position assigned him by law, the freedom he is promised is only a pseudo-freedom that will continue to imprison the subject. Though Wang engages the subject's forced choice between pathology and subjective division in a way that scants the brilliant account provided by Alenka Zupancic, he raises a serious question nonetheless about how freedom signifies here, where it functions less as release from imprisonment and more as freedom from the fear of error that Lacan associates with the ontological form of anxiety. Racialized by the categorical division into predicates of white and black, the subject fears being consigned to blackness as a result of what Lacan calls inertia, a lagging behind the others in their haste to declare themselves white. But the principle on which the puzzle's solution rests predestines to belatedness those assigned the signifier of blackness. In the leap with which Lacan concludes his essay, the leap by which he passes from the subject's determination as white or black to the subject's determination as man or not man, blackness signifies precisely as otherness to what Lacan describes as, quote, the logical notion of the collectivity, unquote, an otherness to the register of reciprocity that establishes the ego in the social dimension of universality, of brotherhood. It is not then insignificant that Lacan refers, albeit in quotation marks, to the black disk as a negative attribute. Among the things that this suggests is that blackness names the locus of anxiety, which is also to say of jouissance, within the frame of symbolic logic. And as such, it excites the plus de jouir unleashed by assimilation into the collectivity of brotherhood. To return to Marriott's formulation then, it is less the appearance of blackness than blackness as the figure of appearance, of non-assimilation into the meaning-making logic of the signifier that provokes this surplus enjoyment as the token of collectivity and assimilation into universality. The pseudo-syllogism that ends Lacan's essay thus deserves to be quoted in full. Here it is. 1. A man knows what is not a man. 2. Men recognize themselves among themselves as men. 3. I declare myself to be a man for fear of being convinced by men that I am not a man. Unquote. What makes this pseudo-logic so striking is that its initial proposition presupposes a knowledge rooted in ontology, the difference between man and not man, which correlates that with that between white and black, and with that between man and woman, only to be followed immediately by a deontologizing counter-assertion, one in which knowing what is not a man now yields to a collective recognition, which is also a collective determination of one's status as a man by others. What the first statement claims a man can know through classical Aristotelian logic, of which Lacan's prime example is telling, tout ce qui n'est pas noir, c'est le non-noir. Everything that isn't black is non-black, gets trumped in the second statement, where the affirmative judgment of manhood relies not on knowledge, but on social acknowledgement. This generates, in place of a logical conclusion that demonstrates one's manhood, only the fear, the ontological anxiety of being convinced one is not a man, which prompts a declaration of manhood deprived of any ontological ground. If blackness, like what is not a man, remains excluded from collectivity, incapable of recognition within any logic of assimilation, then declaring oneself to be a man is inseparable in Lacan's analysis from declaring oneself to be white, or to return to Marriott's analysis, from declaring oneself to be. From within that logic, blackness becomes the self-negating signifier of appearance that must itself be disappeared for signification to reign. A catachresis for what lacks a name or place of its own in the symbolic order. Insofar as the phallus is the signifier for the signifying system as such, and so for the égarement of jouissance that the phallic function imposes, blackness figures what negates that function. The signifier within the signifying order for what is other than signification, and excluded from the universality that signification imposes as sens ab sex. However unwittingly, Lacan suggests that blackness is an existential negation that undoes not the logical predicate, but the act of predication itself. A negation beyond the classical negation of there is by there is not, since the latter still preserves, through the indexical signifier there, the place of being itself. As a catachresis, then, that signifies the symbolic's incompletion, its inability to account for the determinate insignificance on which it rests, blackness exposes the topology of human being, of sens ab sex, as permeated by the absence, the other than logic, that it supersedes. And that may explain why the logic of discourse assures the return of racism as the price we pay for brotherhood and the phantom of universality. I'll conclude then, since we are in the French house, by subjecting you to my terrible French, and as an appendix to the epigraphs with which I began, end with an epigraph or an exergue from Lacan. On aurait tort de ne pas s'apercevoir de ce que l'on constate autour de soi, qu'il n'y a pas un seul propos humain qui ne soit profondément enraciné dans le racisme, enraciné dans la racine. Tous, tels que nous sommes ici, nous sommes tous des racistes. Tout le monde en plus le sait. Tout le monde passe son temps à tout faire pour que pratiquement finisse la race. Mais il est tout à fait clair que c'est absolument indéracinable.
Thank you so much. Time for a question. And we also some other questions.
This is always the least pleasant part, not necessarily the question and answer part, but the part where someone has to come up with a question.
Oh, you mean the absence of question?
No, I'm perfectly happy with the absence of questions. I actually like the absence of questions. The imperative to ask questions seems to be sort of like, you know, a performing seal. Like, okay, let's come up with something. And it doesn't actually give people the time to reflect and to think, do I have a genuine question or am I just asking a question? So
we've got one from the web, and so
Excellent.
maybe the audience will think of one while you answer this.
Or not.
Or not.
Feel compelled.
One of the great minds of our age, MIT professor and political commentator, including on the question of race, Noam Chomsky, called Lacan, quote, an amusing and perfectly self-conscious charlatan, end quote. In a 2012 interview with Veterans Unplugged, he said, quote, quite frankly, I thought he was a total charlatan. He was just posturing for the television cameras in many ways, in the way many Paris intellectuals do. Why this is influential, I haven't the slightest idea. I don't see anything there that should be influential, end quote. Any comment?
We live in a democracy where everyone is entitled to an opinion. I would have guessed that any statement that says, and is being read in the Maison Française, whose predicate is, in the fashion that Paris intellectuals do, is sufficiently self-discrediting not to need a response.
I can ask a question, unless someone would like to ask. Yeah. So coming back to universalism, and first of all, thank you so much for your amazing lecture and your very original interpretation of this game of disc in Lacan's work, and also the way you come back to this écrits is great, really wonderful. So coming back to universalism and the fact that the more you praise universalisms and the more you feel that you belong to a race, to a group, and it reminds me of the politics of friendship by Derrida, and his analysis of brotherhood, of fraternité, band of brothers, and is there, according to you, and perhaps to Lacan, not to Lacan, because he said that it's impossible to escape this feeling of belonging to a group of brothers and sisters. Yeah. So, do you think that there is a way to escape this double bind of, on the one side, praise of universalism, on the other side, feeling that or defending your own race? Is there a way of? Do you think that? As you said with this last quotation of Lacan, that it's impossible to escape this kind of racism.
In a word, yes, I do, because the question seems to me is not even identification so much with one's race, since race itself is a category that's endlessly malleable, and therefore the principle as I would frame it is rather that it is precisely the very belief in something like universality that is always going to reactivate racism, precisely because the claim that one is trying to extend beyond one's clan and produce something like a universal format is always necessarily going to mean that the universalization is predicated on the giving up or sacrifice of that which seems associable with jouissance, associable with a particularized enjoyment. And that means one is always going to be monitoring the other for the refusal to give up that enjoyment. So let's take it out of the realm of race. Coming down here for the first time since COVID struck, we were on the subway. As soon as you go on the subway, if you're a good citizen of the law, as we are, you're wearing masks, and then you begin to notice this jerk next to me is not wearing a mask. That's universal. That's the problem with universalism. He becomes a jerk because he's not wearing a mask. He's not obeying the imperative of universality because he's getting the enjoyment of breathing free air, of not giving a damn about other people's health, of being willing to risk his own life, if that's what he conceptualizes it. He's just going for it. I, on the other hand, insofar as I'm enraged, and therefore am feeling the nascent force of racism, am which has nothing to do with race as we would think of it, but simply of categorization, of logical positions. I want to constrain his jouissance. I want him to obey the law too. That's the logic of universalism. That's why it's irreducible.
Thank you.
There's a couple more web questions. François?
Okay, so thank you so much for this energizing talk. Could you perhaps speak a bit about how the aesthetic might be functioning in your thinking about race or sexuality? Or is the temporal urgency or maybe ontological anxiety you so beautifully described precisely the withdrawal or speculative point of the aesthetic?
Well, it's a really interesting question and a huge one. So I'm going to answer it briefly. And what I would say is, the problem with the aesthetic is the aesthetic always attempts to redeem in the name of form, in the name of coherence, in the name of wholeness. The aesthetic always tries to produce a redemptive moment in which what is threatening, excessive, ugly, grotesque, or obscene is containable. It can be sublated into the beautiful, or it can become aestheticized in and of itself. But every aesthetic movement is a movement that's going to try to eradicate precisely what makes it threatening or difficult. To that extent, the aesthetic is complicit with the constraint of jouissance. It's complicit with the democratizing imperative, and it's thus not necessarily, in my view, going to be a way to evade ontological anxiety. It's always going to be a response to ontological anxiety. And it's going to be a response to ontological anxiety all the more insofar as it's trying to establish at the level of philosophy a sort of aesthetic logic, which is always going to be bound up, as we see in the case of Schiller, with something like an aesthetic education. It's always about a training in the aesthetic, so that the aesthetic can constitute precisely the harmony of a collective.
For someone like me, and me, who is less familiar with Lacan's corpus, do you see an evolution in his thinking on race? Could you put some dates to this? Was there a change with respect to Algeria or to China?
Well, that's also an excellent question, because Lacan's thinking about race gets more explicit. That is to say, the question of race emerges much more in his works in the 1960s and later. But to go back to where I started, his thinking about race wasn't necessarily in that Fanonian register, where he was thinking about it initially in relation to colonialism. He was thinking initially in relation to Judaism and the occupation. He was thinking about the racial laws and the complicity of the French with the assimilation to the order that meant that they were assimilating themselves to a barbarism in accommodating the occupying power and then producing the Vichy government that would represent France in relation to it. So it is true that when he is making his predictions that we are going to see an upsurge of racism, it is mostly in the mid to late 60s and early 70s. But the crucial thing to recognize is that he's not saying we're going to see an upsurge of racism because we're seeing liberation movements or because we're seeing civil rights movements. He's saying we're going to see an upsurge of racism because we're seeing the dissemination of discourses of democracy and the dissemination of discourses of freedom.
The conversation around race is notoriously different in France than in the US. How do you think this Lacanian notion of race is or would be treated differently in each context?
Well, again, I think that goes back to some of what I was saying about the difference between the American reduction of race to something like an epidermal schema, and the willingness of Lacan and the ease with which Lacan can think about race as a symbolic position. That is to say, as a position produced by the fact of language, as opposed to the way that race in the United States context is always going to be dominated by our own implication in the histories of slavery. It's not that France doesn't have its own implication in the histories of slavery, but the centrality of the slave trade to the construction of the American nation, to the wealth of the American nation, and to the dominance of the American nation on the international scene radically transforms the way in which race gets treated, because not only did slavery exist as an institution for so much longer in the United States and at such a massively larger scale in the United States, but also its afterlives, which we continue to live, were so massively repressed in the reality of in the consciousness of our everyday reality. So that, you know, the continuous, what does Tim say, the continuous belated discovery of things like the massacres and the lynchings that, as you look almost everywhere in the United States, you continuously discover. It's the continuous discovery of something that's been discovered and repressed over and over again. And so that structure, which produces, it makes it very difficult in the US context to think race outside of a black-white binarism. With good and bad consequences. I mean, you know, the US has a terrible history of racism, and it did not, you know, put a finish to it in the election of Barack Obama and pretending that we were moving into a post-racial era. Instead, what Lacan predicted came true. Precisely the extension of universalism gave rise to this increased aftermath, the afterlife of that democratization and extension of brotherhood in those heady days. You know, who could forget the January when Obama was inaugurated, and everyone, you know, people were weeping in the streets at the thought that America had turned a page. Well, it had turned a page. It had turned a page closer to Donald Trump. And the reason that Donald Trump became possible is precisely because the celebrations that 4 years earlier, or 8 years earlier, those celebrations were the celebrations of the possibility of a sort of expansion of the scope of American democratization, or the hope of the expansion of that American democratization, that produced the terror of not democratization, but an unbounded enjoyment on the part of those that the Trumpists would see as the privileged, the new privileged, the ones who were replacing the white working class as they conceptualized it. That's so different from France, where the process of colonialism is much more central to the notion of race than it is in the United States. But at the same time, and look, I'm not a prophet, I could well be wrong, but it seems to me it's much more likely that the United States could elect another black president than it is that France would have, that Macron would be succeeded by a black person. I mean, you know, in France it seems, or by an Arab or someone of colonial descent, or, you know, even by Tubira. I mean, you know, it's like that's just unlikely to happen because of the structure of French racial politics. But, you know, I'm going on too long, sorry, so.
Okay, there's a last one, and I feel like this is from your fan club. I'm interested in superimposing queer theory on top of your engaging dialogue with Lacan. Supposing we replace whiteness and blackness in the game using discs with the identities of hetero, homo, trans, and the panoply of nuances therein, could it be possible to presume a predictable solution regarding identity? I'm thinking specifically of imagining a scenario that would take place at the moment of the transition from Restoration to July monarchy, in which, quote, I am a man, takes on malevolent evaluation, not of sexual identity, but of the perception of others, or more precisely, the subject's perception of others' perceptions of their identity. Can we twist Lacanian ideations of racism into the queerness of a, quote, pre-gender identity of the period I have specified?
Sure. The whole point of Lacan's argument is that his argument is clearly one of structural positions, and therefore it is not attached in any predetermined or ontological way to any specific set of categories. All of it follows from the primary orientation of human understanding in the order of language through the repression of absence, of the absence of meaning, of that which is outside the very order of meaning itself. That means, as it were, that in order for us to be human, we must continuously expel from within sans absex, the sex. We must always get rid of what sex signifies. But sex doesn't signify sexual difference in the way that a certain earlier logic of psychoanalysis would have wanted to represent it. Sex signifies the absolutism, the negativity of division, just the pure radical of division without a content. It's the division that produces content. And we mistake the content for the problem when the content is the solution. A little bit like the same thing that Freud said about paranoia. Paranoia is not the disease. The paranoid symptoms are the attempt to cure the disease, to overcome the disease. The construction of male and female is an attempt to overcome the ontological anxiety of a pure difference that is simply negativity. So in that context, what gets produced to suture that difference could be black-white, could be male-female, could be straight-queer, could be homonormative versus trans, or homonormative versus queer. I mean, there are all sorts of possibilities that we can produce. So the first level of answer to the question is absolutely. The next question seems a little bit more historically specific, the part about the restoration and the specific articulation of I am a man. And I think it's hard to know exactly what's motivating that attempt to frame it in that way. But I guess one of the things I would say is that the phrase I am a man travels throughout history in both racial and sexual contexts, so that many of the civil rights movements in the United States, and there are some wonderful photographs of this, show groups of Black men carrying signs that say, I am a man. At the same time, in our own historical moment, one of the crucial things for trans people is for a trans man to be able to say, I am a man, and therefore to be able to use a men's room by asserting, I am a man. One of the questions that raises, however, is whether each of those instances is still trying to reassert, reaffirm, and shore up the very category of being a man. And insofar as that's the case, what the political stakes are there. Now, it's certainly necessary and crucial to be able to recognize the social consequences of being excluded from the category I am a man in the Lacanian pseudo-syllogism that ends his essay on logical time. To not be a man is to be determined by the others to be that which must be excluded from the register of community. And thus it's a potentially lethal position. So one doesn't want blithely to say that there is a political liability to reinforcing the category of man itself within that context. But at the same time, it seems to be absolutely clear that this questioner is wholly on target in suggesting that the imperative to affirm as a positive identity one's place in the world and one's place in a community by saying something on the order logically of I am a man is foundational to the symbolic order, is the locus of ontological anxiety, and is the reason that racism is ineradicable.
Okay. So, any question? Yeah.
You just stand up. All right, I was just.
Say your
Alright.
first name.
So, hi, I'm Nick, and my question is very simple. So what would be, in your opinion, an alternative to universalism?
I'm not going to solve I'm not going to solve the problem here. There's, there are alternatives to universalism, of course. There is authoritarianism, there's absolutism, there's aristocracy. There are all sorts of possibilities. The question that I think is in the background of your question is, would those solve the problem of racism? From Lacan's perspective, they would solve a particular modern version of the problem of racism, but they wouldn't solve the problem of what he called the barbarism that is assimilated into every human collectivity. I mean, for Lacan, it's not insignificant that the rise of the global slave trade coincides with the rise of the middle class and with discourses of democratization. I mean, these two things for him are historically related. That isn't to say that there wasn't a class consciousness prior to the rise of the slave trade. But racism as we know it now, not so sure.
Thank you.
So it's perhaps time to say that it's over. And I would like to thank you once more, Lee, for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.